Let's get right to it. The passage I'll be teaching from can be found in the book of Genesis. We're in a series in Genesis looking at the question of what were we created for? What were we created for? And today we're going to find out that we were created for rest. And the passage I'll be teaching from can be found in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. This morning when I told Lily, my wife, that I would be preaching on rest, she told me that I would be the least qualified person to do that. And it's true. But I'm not preaching from my life, I'm preaching from Scripture. And so I get a pass. Right? And it's kind of ironic that I would be preaching on this topic at this particular point in my life, because I'm quite busy these days, and probably this week has been one of the hardest weeks of this year, and I don't feel very rested. But I'll try my best. So one of the issues that is on the minds of a lot of people is the issue of work-life balance. Right? How do you balance work with life, with raising family, with spending time in leisure, with exercise, with church? It's amazing how prevalent this topic is. I mean, you can find articles about this in newspapers and magazines. And the prevalence of this topic just tells me that a lot of people are finding work-life balance very, very difficult. People are finding themselves working way too much and not having enough time for those other things, those important things like family and friends and church and so on. It used to be that one parent worked, now two. Right? It used to be that people worked 9 to 5, but now with the advent of email and other technologies, it's possible to work non-stop, even at home. So passages like the one that I read to you, Genesis 2, 1 to 3, show the wisdom of God. And knowing that we would struggle with work-life balance, knowing that we would struggle with working non-stop, and addressing that potential problem in us, that problem that makes us slaves to our work. We know passages like Genesis 2, 1 to 3, must have had special resonance with the original hearers, the Jews, because you have to realize that in their family history, they were once slaves in Egypt. And as slaves, they never got a day off. They never had a day of rest. And how amazing would it have been for them to discover that God, who had delivered them from slavery, was now concerned that they would have a day of rest, that they would rest in their lives. Now let's take a look at this passage. What we see in this passage that immediately gets our attention is that God rested on the seventh day. The Hebrew word that's used here is Shabbat, the word from which we get Sabbath. It means cease from work activity. Cease from work activity. Now, when this word is used to describe what God does, it must mean something slightly different from what it usually means when people rest. None of the reasons that people rest can be applied to God. God doesn't get tired. God doesn't get weary. And to make a long story short, because this isn't a major point, this is quite a minor point, God resting could be likened to what we might do when we build something, when we build a treehouse, for example. What do we do when we build a treehouse? Well, we get into it. Right? We start enjoying it. We start taking delight in what we've created. Well, on the seventh day, God finished creating the world, and he rested. He enjoyed the fruit of his labor, in a sense. He took delight in it. He started enjoying it. He started dwelling in it. Now, the other curious thing about this passage is verse 3, where it says, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Now, whatever that means, I mean, commentators have a lot of different opinions about what that might mean. At least it means this. At least it means that the rest wasn't for God alone. Do you follow me here? If God blessed that day, it must mean that God wanted other people to take part in the blessing of that day, to take part in the blessing of the enjoyment of creation. For example, if I ask God to bless today, this Sunday, what am I asking? Am I asking for God to be blessed? No, I'm asking for the people who come to the service on this day to be blessed, or for me to be blessed. And in the same way, when God blessed the seventh day, the purpose of that was that this day would be for the whole world to take part in the blessing of the enjoyment of creation. So I guess you could put it this way. The day of rest, Sabbath, is a universal blessing given to all of humanity. I'm going to come back to that point. Just remember that. But right now, let me give you a little history lesson on the Sabbath. The next time we encounter this particular word in Scripture is when God makes a covenant with Jewish people who he recently rescued from slavery in Egypt. Covenant, if you don't know, is an absolutely binding agreement between two parties. And if you know anything about that covenant that God made with the rescued people on Mount Sinai, you know that it was a conditional covenant. A conditional covenant centered around the giving and the keeping of the Ten Commandments. Now, 9 of those commandments were moral commandments of love towards God and towards neighbor. Okay? 9 of those commandments were moral commandments such as do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness, and so on. But one of those commandments was not a moral commandment. It was a commandment concerning the remembrance of the Sabbath. It was the 4th commandment. And this was not a moral commandment because the Sabbath is not a moral law. Do you know what the Sabbath is? The Sabbath is a sign of the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. It's a sign. It's a sign, right? Just like the rainbow was a sign of the covenant between Noah and God, and circumcision was a sign of the covenant between Abraham and God, Sabbath was a sign of the covenant between Israel and God. So Exodus 31:12-17 talks about this. It's quite a long passage. I'm just going to read the first 2 verses. And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbath, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. Okay? So are you following me so far? No, this is very theological. This is kind of getting deep into the Old Testament archetypes or types. And some of you might have already mentally checked out. But I wanted to explain this anyway because some of you, at least one of you, have asked me the question, should we observe the Sabbath? Should we observe the Sabbath? It's in the 10 Commandments. Do we have to observe the Sabbath? And you can probably figure out from what I've said, the answer is no. No, we don't have to observe the Sabbath, but it's a qualified no. Okay? It's not an absolute no. It's a qualified no. And I'm going to explain what I mean. Sabbath observance is no longer required of us because we're no longer under the Mosaic law. Just like we don't make animal sacrifices anymore. Have you noticed that? I'm not up here sacrificing a lamb or a bull or a goat. Why not? Why don't we do that anymore? Because animal sacrifices, though they were required for a certain time and purpose and people and place, were provisional. They were never meant to be permanent. They were provisional. Okay. Do you know what animal sacrifices were? Did you think they were really a vehicle of obtaining God's forgiveness? And did you think that animal sacrifices forgave people's sins? No. No, they served to illustrate the deadly consequence of sin and to point ahead to the time when Jesus the Messiah would come and become the ultimate sacrifice, the only sacrifice that's efficacious. Animal sacrifices were a shadow of the things to come, according to Hebrews 10:1. And when that thing came, that animal sacrifices were pointing to, they were no longer necessary. They were no longer necessary because they were all fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And similarly, the Sabbath points to something beyond itself. The Sabbath points to the rest that Jesus would give us. Remember when Jesus said he is the Lord of the Sabbath? Remember that? Well, what he means is that the Sabbath points to him. Jesus gives us rest, and the Sabbath points to that reality. Now, I have to be very careful because people hear the word rest and they only think of rest in psychological terms. They psychologize this word. So when they hear Jesus gives us rest, they think, okay, Jesus gives us inner peace or inner tranquility or absence of conflict or turmoil or trouble in our lives. And then when they don't experience it themselves, they wonder what's going on. Why don't I experience this inner peace or tranquility that Jesus is promising us? Is that the rest that Jesus gives us, though? Is that the rest that Jesus promises? Well, do you remember that verse in Matthew 11:28 and 29? In that verse, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Okay? Very, very famous verse. Favorite verse for a lot of people. Well, we do that verse a major disservice if we think that Jesus is just talking about a therapeutic inner peace. He isn't just talking about a therapeutic inner peace. Read that in context, okay? Read it in context and you discover that the two passages that follow that particular one are ones in which Jesus has major confrontations with Pharisees. And what are the confrontations about? Well, they're confrontations about what Jesus and his disciples can and cannot do on the Sabbath. So Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees come along and say, hey, you can't do that. You can't do that on the Sabbath. Or Jesus and his disciples are walking across the field, and his disciples are picking grains from the stalks, and the Pharisees jump out of the wheat and say, hey, you can't do that either. And the reason the Pharisees were so adamant, so inflexible about this, was that they had placed on the people a burden of 39 prohibitions of things that you couldn't do on the Sabbath. So they included things like how far you could walk, or what you could lift, or what you could tie or untie, or whether you could wear perfume or not. 39 prohibitions. And what's interesting is that these prohibitions weren't in the Mosaic Law. Were there 39 prohibitions in the Mosaic? No, they weren't. So where did the new ones come from? They made it up. They made them up. Why would they do that? Why would they make up new prohibitions? Because if you believe that your acceptability to God depends on your perfect obedience to the law, then you would become so anxious about whether you kept those laws perfectly or not that you would add extra ones for extra measure just to be safe. Right? So that you wouldn't even come close to breaking those laws. And that's what the Pharisees did. They were teaching this to the people, and it was an incredibly heavy burden on the people. And Jesus comes along and says, come to me. Come to me and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. The rest that Jesus gives us is the kind of rest from being able to stop trying to prove ourselves to God and to other people that we are acceptable, that we're okay, that we're worthy or good enough to warrant God's approval of us. Jesus sets us free from that. He gives us rest from the fear and anxiety of wondering whether we've done enough, whether we've been good enough, whether we've obeyed enough laws. And what that will do for us is we won't try to meet God's expectations of us in such a way that we feel that we have merited His approval. And that's the kind of rest that Jesus gives us. The kind of rest where we can stop laboring to prove ourselves to people and to God over and over every day of our lives. Right? And we do this. Right? Boy, do we do this. I wonder how many of us are, have self-hatred in our hearts. Hate ourselves because we're not holy enough, we're not spiritual enough, we're not intelligent enough, we're not beautiful enough. And Jesus gives us rest from that self-loathing and that self-hatred. For some of us, it's even worse. Right? Some of us are proud because we think we're good enough. That's worse. And we're constantly trying to maintain this false, self-constructed self-image of being a good person. But Jesus gives us rest from that as well. Rest from fear, rest from anxiety, rest from pride, rest from having to prove ourselves again and again and again. All right. So the Sabbath, as practiced by the Jews with its prohibitions, we're not bound to that. We're not under the old covenant where we have to keep the Ten Commandments or else. Right? We're under a new covenant of grace rather than under the old covenant of law. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have to keep the Ten Commandments. I know I'm being inconsistent, okay? Because I just said we don't have to keep the Ten Commandments. So what do you mean? Do we have to keep the Ten Commandments or not? Well, we keep the Ten Commandments for a totally different reason. Right? We don't keep the Ten Commandments thinking, I have to do this, otherwise God's not going to accept me or love me. But rather we think, He loves me, He accepts me, I'm doing this as a response of worship and love to God. They're two different things. They're two different animals. They come from two different motivations. Both lead to a life of obedience. But one obeys out of a motivation of self-righteousness, which leads to pride and anxiety and fear. But the other obeys out of a motivation of trust and love, which leads to humility and rest. All right. Now, I've been talking about Sabbath as a sign. I haven't really gotten deep into this issue of Sabbath as something that was originally created for the benefit of all mankind. Okay? So I want to talk about that now. So we've been talking about Sabbath as a sign that points to Jesus, but we need to talk about Sabbath as a blessing for all of humanity. So this is what Sabbath still means for us as Christians. Do you remember the time when Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees for healing on the Sabbath? And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, man is not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath is made for man. Do you know what that means? Man is not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath for man. Well, he's teaching the original meaning of the Sabbath. And the original meaning of the Sabbath was that Sabbath was something that was designed in creation for the sake of all of humanity, not just for the sake of Israel. For all of humanity. So should we observe the Sabbath? Should we observe the Sabbath? No. Yes. Yes. No. Well, if we recognize that the Sabbath reflects God's humanitarian wisdom, that if we don't observe the Sabbath, we're not living life as God intended for us to live. And we're going to crash and burn. And somehow we're going to become less human. Then you'll realize that we do need to keep the Sabbath. Not religiously, but as a matter of wisdom. Why don't we? Why don't I? That's what I want to talk about next. 3 things, 3 reasons we don't keep the Sabbath. And the first is this. Some of us have grown up with a distorted view that the spirit is what matters and the body doesn't matter. The spiritual is good, the physical is bad. The spiritual is what's important, the physical is not important. And what that view often leads to is abuse of the body, the overtaxing of the body, placing too great a demand on the body, counting on the spirit to somehow compensate for how we treat the body. Usually it doesn't work that way. Usually it doesn't work that way. I guess sometimes, God could supernaturally give me energy even though I haven't slept for the past 3 or 4 days. But usually it doesn't work that way, because in reality we're not just spiritual beings, right? We are a psychosomatic unity of body and spirit. Genesis 2:7 talks about this. It says that we're made of dust. Right? We're dust. We have the breath of life in us. We have God's breath in us. So we are spiritually cognizant beings, but we're still dust. And let me tell you, I want to deny that I'm dust. I want to push myself to the limit. And I learned this lesson the hard way when I was in university. This attitude of underappreciating the body, what led me to in university was to work 20 hours a day, 20 hours a week, work part-time for 20 hours, take 5 courses, and get 3 or 4 hours of sleep per night. Okay? And that left me very, very unhappy. Very, very irritable, very, very cranky. I knew that this wasn't the way that God wanted me to be, so I prayed. I fasted. I engaged in spiritual disciplines, and it didn't help. It made things worse, actually, because I got even less sleep. Now, I can look at this from hindsight and see what I needed was not to ask God to compensate for my lack of sleep, but to sleep. I needed more sleep. I'm dust. I need sleep. I need food. I need exercise. I need a day of rest. And walking with God means not only praying regularly and reading His scripture and trying to obey Him, but it also means taking care of our bodies, taking care of ourselves. And if I had been more spiritually attuned, instead of taking 5 courses, I would have taken 3. I would have chosen to slow down, discerning that if I didn't slow down, if I took all those courses and worked all those hours, I wouldn't be taking care of myself. I would be more susceptible to giving in to temptation. It would be harder for me to walk with God. So that decision about how many courses to take, it didn't seem like a spiritual decision at the time. It seemed like an educational issue rather than a spiritual issue, but it was a spiritual issue. It was. Similarly, for some of you, obeying God, listening to God, being spiritually attentive will mean taking fewer work shifts. Because working the current number of work shifts that you're working right now is draining you, is burning you out, is preventing you from walking closely with God. For some of you, it might mean choosing not to be available for work on Sunday so that you can come to church. For some of you, it might mean eating regularly instead of skipping meals, because if you skip meals, you're just going to shut down physically and mentally. If you're suffering from depression, it might mean taking that antidepressant medicine regularly, because you know that if you don't take that medicine, you'll just become depressed again. Now, these things, we don't think of them as being laden with spiritual implications, but they are laden with spiritual implications, and we need to be wise and godly and spiritual. What we need to do is we need to be attuned to what God is nudging us to do. And it might be that He is nudging us to work less, to go to bed earlier, to get more exercise, and so on. Secondly, you're not God. News to you? You're not God, but you're trying to act like God. You're not running the universe. Right? So you can take a day off. If you were trying to run the universe, you would never take a day off. But that's God's responsibility to run the universe. It's not yours. If you rest, things are not going to fall apart. And if you can't rest, if you think you can't rest because, if you rest, your life is going to just fall apart, you're trying to act like God. By taking a day off, by going to bed earlier and so on, that's a sign of faith that there's a God in heaven, you're not Him. Okay? Everything depends on Him. It doesn't depend on you. Everything depends on Him. Thirdly, many of us feel that we never have enough time to get things done. And so we can't rest. And you're right, if what needs to get done is to get straight A's and move up the career ladder as fast as you can and be the perfect parent and raise the perfect child, you're right. You don't have enough time. And you need to cut back on your sleep. You need to cut back on the day of rest. But the gospel counteracts that impulse in us by declaring to us that our value, our worth, our significance doesn't come from the function that we perform or how well we perform that function. But it's inherent in us by virtue of the fact that we are created in the image of God and we are absolutely loved by Him. Do you know what the gospel says to us? Because of the obedience of Jesus Christ, the obedience that led Him to go to the cross voluntarily, your personal failures and sins and transgressions won't be counted against you because it was already counted against Him. And divine justice, which must exist, right? Otherwise this universe is a parody, it's a farce, it's an absurdity where evil reigns and the innocent people don't get any justice. Justice didn't fall on you because it fell on Him. And now you are His beloved, adopted into the family of God. You are His beloved son. You are His beloved daughter. And if you really, really, truly believe this, I think you'll be able to rest from all your labors. Because this will seem such good news to you, you won't try to look for good news in other things. When we hear this so often, the danger is that we become acculturated to this message. We look for good news to make our day. But every day we need to be confronted by this good news. Every day we need to be confronted by this good news. The art of the Christian life is that we continually find this good news. That we continually sink this message deeper and deeper into our hearts until it strikes a reservoir of joy. So we don't feel that we need to get straight A's, otherwise I'm a nobody. Or we need that successful career, otherwise I'm unimportant. So we can rest. So that we don't need to be always at work trying to achieve the perfect life, the perfect career, the perfect child, or whatever. Because we have worth and value and identity in Him. And because of that, we can rest. Let's pray.